There are times where, even in the heat of competition, athletes appear to be in complete control. No matter what's going on around them, they seem totally comfortable, and everything they're doing in response looks like the most natural thing ever. Lamar Jackson comes to mind as someone who does this kind of thing a lot. Whether he's throwing or running, Lamar's feel for the game is just about unmatched. He stays calm even when some of the best athletes in the world are running straight at him, and then proceeds to make some of the most athletic plays you've ever seen look like they're the easiest thing ever. So how does that happen? Other than Lamar just being an alien, which, just to be clear, he totally is, how does one person handle that much information and distraction and even potential danger and keep turning it into something productive? The answer to that is pretty simple, although there are quite a few different names for it. You may have heard an athlete like this described as being in the zone or locked in, but for the purposes of this video, we're going to refer to this state by the name given to it by Hungarian psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi: flow. Flow is that mental condition where a person, athlete or otherwise, is so focused on what they're doing that essentially nothing else matters. They have become one with whatever it is they're doing, and unless something comes along to knock them out of it, or the activity ends, they will continue to exist in that kind of altered state of consciousness. Now, I've got to be honest, this is the kind of psychology thing that I'm typically pretty skeptical of, and that's partly because of how ubiquitous it is. There are books and YouTube videos and podcasts all dedicated to this idea and how it can help all kinds of people become less distracted and more productive. Because that does sound pretty great, right? A kind of magical state that you can get into to be the most effective version of yourself. But whether you're an accountant during tax season or Lamar Jackson in the playoffs, flow isn't magic. We can experience flow ourselves and see evidence of it in others, so we know that it exists in some capacity. But there's got to be some kind of concrete explanation for what's happening there. So in this episode, that's exactly what we're going to be looking for. An understanding of flow that goes beyond what we feel when we're experiencing it and can put it in terms that feel less magical and more methodical. To do that, I reached out to Dr. Dimitri van der Linden, a professor of organizational psychology at Erasmus University Rotterdam, and one of the world's leading researchers in flow and the neuroscience behind it. So what does he say that flow is?
It's a state of extreme focus. Yeah, so when people are in flow, most of the time they're very, very focused. It's one of the main characteristics of flow. And related to that is that people have less other cognitions. So for example, if you are gaming and you are in a flow, or sometimes they call it in the zone or locked in, or there are different terms for that. Yeah, you kind of really focus on what you're doing, and you're not thinking about the possible outcomes. You know, you don't think about things you still have to do, or you don't even think about yourself. You're really, really focused on the task.
And because of that focus, performance on that task typically improves. Like, think back to a time when you've been completely engrossed in a project. No matter how intense the effort actually is, it feels almost effortless. Distractions become easier to ignore, your sense of time gets completely warped, and for that moment, you are completely and fully engaged in what you're doing. And that is flow. This is how athletes paradoxically do some of the hardest physical things in the world while making them look like they're barely trying at all. But that's the part that we kind of already know about. Even if they don't understand the nuts and bolts of it, most people have some idea what flow is and what it kind of feels like. So what about the other part? What is actually happening in your brain when you are in that flow state, as best you can describe it, because I know that's hard.
Well, the brain is very complex. There are many different areas, have different functions. But you can also look at the brain in more larger brain systems. So within the brain, there are systems that consist of different structures. And those have very clear, relatively clear functions.
The two main systems that we're going to talk about when it comes to flow are known as the default mode network and the central executive network. Like a lot of other systems in the brain, they kind of work as an opposing pair. If one is active, the other one isn't, and vice versa. But together, they help your brain process all kinds of different types of information. The default mode network is there to help you deal with information that's about you, internally. If you're doing introspective tasks like ruminating or recalling specific memories, the default mode network is the thing powering that.
When it's active, you're kind of thinking about yourself in the future or in the past. You kind of play off different scenarios, so what possibly might happen, right? So for example, if you're sitting on a couch, you're not engaged in any particular thing, well, you start kind of thinking about, you're daydreaming more or less. You're thinking about, what happened in the past, what happened in the future.
If you're trying to process what happened in a social interaction or the way you're experiencing something emotionally, the default mode network is super useful. Where it is not useful is when you're trying to do a specific task, like play a sport. That responsibility falls to the central executive network. This is the part of the brain that makes decisions and keeps you focused, and not coincidentally, it's the system that's chiefly responsible for getting you and keeping you in a flow state.
It directs your attention to relevant parts of the task, and it also blocks distractions. You can imagine that you're working on something, you're doing a chess game, and then you're very focused, but sometimes thoughts or noises of things from the environment might come in, and if the system allows you to block that more or less.
Balance between these two networks is a big part of how someone gets into a flow state or not. Put another way, whichever is more active between the default mode network and the central executive network can be the difference between an anxious athlete who's pondering past mistakes, which makes it more likely they will make more in the future, and the one who's locked in and not worrying about that kind of thing. You can also think about flow as something that's happening in your brain chemically. Certain neurotransmitters like norepinephrine or dopamine are heavily involved in flow states, and when you think about what flow states actually are and when they tend to happen, that makes a lot of sense. Norepinephrine is produced by a part of your brain known as the locus coeruleus, which is activated when you do something stimulating, like playing a sport. This is the system in your brain that allows you to feel excited, just like you would be in the middle of the heat of competition. That excitement helps keep you focused, and just as importantly, helps keep the default mode network from becoming too active. But how it does that is also super important, because you can't just do anything and get into flow. If you could, this whole video would be pretty pointless. Part of the excitement you feel in a flow state comes from being tested. The task has to be difficult enough to keep your brain working hard, but not so difficult that it feels impossible. This is called the skills challenge balance, and as Dimitri has found in his research, it's incredibly important when it comes to flow.
It's known that the best place the best way to get flow is when you have a good skill match between the skills you have and the level of challenge. So it has to be on the right match. It doesn't have to be, if it's too difficult, then it becomes frustrated. If it's too easy, it's boring. So it has to be a perfect match. And then we're thinking, okay, what is the psychological process behind that? And it might actually be progress.
Think back to a time when you've been working on something really challenging, whether it was at work or school or playing a sport. What got you to the end? Because if it was really challenging, chances are you didn't nail it the first time you tried. A lot of the research on flow would suggest that no matter what that task was, the idea of making progress was probably a big part of that. We'll talk about what that means for the longer term in a bit, but usually, the excitement and reward that you're chasing in a flow state doesn't come all at once. Think about playing a really challenging level in a video game. The developers know that if you have to keep starting all the way over, you'll probably quit, or at least you will if you're anything like me. So, what do? They use things like checkpoints, so you can experience smaller rewards on your way to the big one you'll get once you finally beat the level. This is also how athletes deal with setbacks and stay in flow. Even if Lamar Jackson gets sacked or throws an interception, he just gets back onto the field and tries again next time. Every completion, every first down, every drive that ends in a score serves as a sign of progress towards the ultimate goal of winning the game. And the reason that works is pretty simple. Of all the neurotransmitters that exist, and so far we've identified something like 100 of them, dopamine is right up there as the most important. It's connected to a whole bunch of stuff happening in your body, including anything from attention to movement to memory. But its best known function is as your brain's reward system. Simply put, flow does not happen without the reward waiting at the end of it. Whether it's a new activity, a complex one, a risky one, or whatever else, getting into a flow state typically requires something called a dopamine trigger to kick the whole thing off. And if that isn't there, like if you're doing some very tedious task for work that doesn't have a significant payoff, that can feel like a real slog, which is pretty much the opposite of flow.
You know that you have to do it, but it's not nice. And it's also not very rewarding if you finish it. So in that case, you really have to force yourself to do it. And then, your brain often starts to protest, tries to run away from the task. So you have to force it, so that doesn't feel like you're in the flow. It doesn't go automatically, as in the same sense as if it's conducted with help of the reward system.
Yeah, and that's an interesting breakdown because the administrative task is a really good example because I don't think anybody flows when they're, grading student papers or trying to, get a bunch of, forms filled out for whatever job.
But unless you're a bookkeeper and if you enjoy, you think, well, that's really nice, and I make a job of that, and you're really into it, and you work on it, and you enjoy it, then for that person, of course, that can lead to a flow. But for most people, the administrative stuff, it is something they have to do.
But that's another good point. The reward system works differently for everybody, and everybody's flow is it's triggered by different things. No matter what gets you into flow, there are a few pretty universal markers of it that have been observed in the research. Time passes faster because you aren't aware of it. Concentration is suddenly effortless. Worry and self-judgment aren't really a thing because the default mode network is off. And most of all, you feel a sense of oneness with your work that is hard to experience in any other setting. It's also self-perpetuating. The more you lean into flow, the better you typically perform, at which point you lean in even more. And that whole thing just continues as a kind of positive feedback loop. Flow exists in a sweet spot where attention, reward, excitement, and challenge all converge in just the right way. And because of that, it can be kind of hard to replicate in a lab setting. But researchers like Dimitri study flow in the lab all the time, either by reviewing the subjective experiences of people who have their skills matched or mismatched in a particular task, or by tracking the activity of certain brain regions, such as the central executive network, as that task is being done.
In the situation where there is a match, is that also the situation where we find the lowest activity, for example, of the default mode network, and the highest activity of the focus network? And also, do people indeed subjectively or the most flow in that condition? And then if that all goes in the same direction, you can say, okay, well, apparently in this condition, people say they were more in a flow. We see that in their brains, brain activity, and we see it in the performance. So it seems that flow has something to do with these brain systems.
There is, however, a lot of debate over what flow actually is, or the best way to understand it. For instance, there's something like the idea of runner's high, where endorphins or cannabinoids are released in response to exercise, fundamentally altering your experience of it. Is that flow? Maybe. It may not fit all of the criteria we established earlier, but it's similar enough that it's worth asking the question, and suggests that there might be different types of flow that are triggered by different bodily processes. But there's also a really big and important question right at the core of flow research, which not even Dimitri is fully sure of how to answer.
Is it just like extreme concentration? Or is it a very specific, unique state that only happens in certain conditions? And I'm not 100% sure.
So here's a question. With all of that in mind, how does a flow state actually happen? There are a lot of articles out there about flow as a concept, but a pretty high percentage of them are solely about how to get into them. But is there anything to that? Well, maybe, but a better place to start might be how not to get into flow. Generally speaking, things like stress, anxiety, and distraction, all of which are connected to the activity of the default mode network, are obstacles to getting into flow. There may also be personality types that are more or less prone to flow. But getting into a flow state on purpose, that's a little trickier.
You can create conditions that enhances your probability of getting in the flow, probably, yeah? But it's not 100% sure if you will get in the flow. And particularly when you try really hard to get in a flow, you might actually not be in a flow. It's like falling asleep. If you really try hard to fall asleep, probably your default mode network will be very active because you're thinking about your own, you have a very high awareness of yourself. You really try hard. Yeah, it might not be working that well.
There is, however, one tip that I would give out to any athlete or anyone really who's trying to get into a flow state more often, and that's to learn to embrace the positives. We talked earlier about how important dopamine and reward and progress are to flow, but learning to identify things as rewarding or as progress can be a big part of that. Like maybe you're a golfer and you're in the middle of a match play round against a tough opponent and you're feeling locked in, but then you drop a hole that you feel like you should have won pretty early on. That's obviously not ideal, but maybe you made a better score on that hole today than you did earlier in the week in practice, or maybe you drove the ball further, hit the green in regulation. You could focus on the loss, which might knock you out of flow, or you could focus on those smaller wins, which could keep you in it. This, in my estimation, is one of the most underrated things that elite athletes are able to do consistently. Yeah, they make mistakes, and sometimes they're very high-profile ones, but they don't dwell on them. Put another way, they're able to keep their default mode network from getting too active at any given time and stay focused on the task at hand. You want to learn how to get into flow more often? Ironically, not trying and getting out of your own head a little bit may actually be the answer. Just, let things flow a little bit and see what happens. Circling back to some of the questions that we started all this with, I think we can now definitively say that flow is a thing. It may not be the elevated, transcendent state that some people think it is, but it definitely does exist. And there are areas of the brain that are directly responsible for it. And if you can learn how to embrace it, which may or may not involve not thinking about it at all, you can make some pretty neat stuff happen. Watching an athlete who's truly in flow can be absolutely breathtaking, because what you're seeing is someone riding that very narrow mental tightrope with complete comfort and ease. They're not thinking. They're just letting things happen as naturally as possible. And the results speak for themselves. Hi everyone, my name is Will, and this is my channel, Student of the Game, where I make video essays about sports psychology and culture. This video is pretty heavily on the psychology side, which I really enjoy doing every now and then. And on that note, this will be the first and what will hopefully be a few episodes on concepts in sports psychology that a lot of people talk about but probably don't fully understand. And to be clear, I don't fully understand them either. Part of that journey will be speaking to experts like Dimitri, and my job is to be the messenger who brings those people to you guys. Hopefully y'all will be into those too, but if you enjoyed this episode, please do give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like it. Until next time, I'm Will. See you then.